So what's your full name?
James Frederick, Frederick, Sterner.
And Fred, I can call you Fred?
Jim.
Excuse me, Jim. So Jim Sterner, what unit did you serve with in World War II?
I was with K Company of the 333rd Infantry Regiment, 84th Infantry Division. The 84th Infantry Division was the rail splitters in honor of Abe Lincoln. In World War I, it was called the Abe Lincoln Division, and between the wars, it was the Illinois National Guard. So we considered Springfield, Illinois, our home city.
Now, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted in the Army.
Did you have a job while you were in high school?
Not a real job, no. I went to high school in Wilmington, Delaware, and was graduated in June of 1941, just before December 41, Pearl Harbor. And that summer I worked in the Pullman shops in Wilmington, refinishing Pullman cars.
Was your parents upset that you joined the Army?
Not really. My parents were divorced, and in high school I was living with my father and stepmother in Wilmington. Through the 9th grade, I lived with my mother in Allentown, Pennsylvania. But when it came time that I was 19 years old and a high school graduate, I knew I had to go into service because I felt very self-conscious taking a bus or going anywhere. I had the guilty conscience of not being in the service during the war. So I enlisted in December of 1942 while I was in college. My father told me that he would not give me any advice as to what service to enlist in, because if something happened, he would never forgive himself. But he did say that if I enlisted in the Coast Guard, he could arrange it that I would guard the Wilmington Marine Terminal for the rest of the war, because my father was in the Customs Service, which at that time was under the Treasury Department, as was the Coast Guard. So he had a lot of contacts. And I can tell you, when I was in a foxhole in Germany, I often thought about why didn't I listen to the old man and go. I'd be in Wilmington with my wife, because I was married before I went overseas.
Wow. Where did you go to basic training?
Camp Walters, Texas.
Did you meet any other Pennsylvania boys down there with you?
Yes, I met a guy named Bob Sheehan from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, and Bob Sheehan and I became very close friends in basic training, and then after basic training, Bob and I both qualified for the Army Specialized Training Program. Are you familiar with ASTP? Okay, good. I don't have to explain that then.
Mm-hmm. My grandfather was in the 10th Armored Division, and they had a big ASTP program. And then, of course, they canceled all of it and sent everybody overseas. So, when did you find out you were going to be a member of the 84th Division?
On April 1st, 1944. I had been a ASTP boy at Drexel in Philadelphia, and that program, as you say, was canceled. And we were taken from Philly on a troop train down to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, which was mostly an engineers base. So we figured we were all going to the engineers. And when we got off the train, we were lined up in a field, and at that time, we were told, and to be an ASTP, you almost had to be a buck private. You weren't allowed to get any promotions, even to PFC. And we were in a field, and we were told that we were now buck privates in a frontline infantry rifle company. And I turned to the guy next to me, whose name was Don Stauffer, and I said, Don, surely the Army's playing an April Fool joke on us, April 1st, 44. But it wasn't an April Fool joke, and we were indeed the bottom of the food chain.
If after Texas, did you go anywhere else for infantry training or anything like that?
Well, after Texas, I went to Drexel for about 6 months, and then to Claiborne, to the 84th Division, which was training. So we were in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, April through September, when we got on a train to go up to Jersey to go overseas.
So in Claiborne is that where the whole 84th Division formed?
The 84th Division formed in Camp Howes, Texas.
Okay.
Then there was a big maneuver, and after the maneuvers down south, which involved a number of divisions, it ended up at Claiborne, Louisiana, near Alexandria.
So by the time you get to Jersey, was there a particular Liberty ship you guys took from New York to overseas?
We were on a big passenger liner, which was, as I understand it, it was the largest steam-powered ocean liner at the time. It was renamed the George Washington, and it was a troop ship.
Yeah. And did you guys go to England first or anything like that?
We landed in the big bay in, is it Greenock or something, Scotland? And then we got off the ship on to lighters that took us ashore, got on a train, and we rode the train from Scotland down to southern England, near Andover, England, to an old British Army base where we lived in Quonset huts for about a month.
Then, I guess, when did you find out you'd be going over to, did you go to France first?
Well, we were in the Quonset huts in England with physical training and indoctrination. And for some reason, somehow, and I have no idea why, I was picked to drive a Jeep with a big loaded trailer behind it from that camp to Southampton. So I drove that Jeep onto an LST at Southampton and went across the channel on the LST, and we landed at Omaha Beach. Thank goodness it wasn't D-Day. It was I think D plus 250 or something like that. So there was no problem going ashore at Omaha Beach.
Right. So the 84th Division reached France in which month?
I think it was November 1st.
November, okay.
Yeah, I think it was either November 1st or 2nd.
Okay, and there was, as far as I know, there was still cleanup operations in France. Did you guys see action in France, or?
No, we saw no action in France. Okay. We stayed about 100 yards back from Omaha Beach, back from the channel, in pup tents for a couple of nights. And then a convoy came, and we were in a truck convoy across France, sleeping out in the open fields. Went through Paris. I remember going through the through the tunnels underground, and through Belgium. I think we went through Belgium a little bit, but into the Netherlands anyway.
Okay. So you went to the Netherlands first?
Went to the Netherlands, and we stayed in a Catholic schoolhouse in a town which we pronounced Herleen, but it's spelled Heerlen. I think in Dutch they would say Heerlen.
Is this where the division first saw action, or did...
Actually, no. We stayed in that schoolhouse for about a week. And at that time, the 333rd Regiment was assigned to the British Army. So we were under a British general whose name I can't remember, but I do know that we were Sherwood Yeoman Rangers. And I do know that we got a half a canteen cup of rum per day ration being in the British Army.
Wow.
But we were taken by British lorries from that schoolhouse right to the border of the Netherlands and Holland and Germany. And we got out, and that's when we started an attack into Germany and walked into the German city of Geilenkirchen. We say we captured Geilenkirchen, but actually the Germans pulled back, took everybody with them. We never saw a German civilian. In fact, most of the furniture was all gone out of the houses.
What month was this now?
November.
So November of 44, you guys are fighting on the German-Netherlands border.
That's correct.
And is this the first time you saw a German soldier?
Never. Well, first German soldiers I saw were people who had been captured, and they were marching these guys to the rear. And a little story that goes with that is while we were being indoctrinated in Holland, we were told that the war was essentially over, that the Germans were scraping the bottom of the barrel, and that the guys we'd be fighting against were either young kids who were drafted or old men that the Germans were putting into service. And when on our way into Geilenkirchen, we saw these prisoners being marched back, and we looked at them, and they were good-looking, sturdy, 22, 23-year-old men.
Right.
We said, what happened to these old guys?
Right. I've heard other veterans say that too. Did you have, as a mortarman, did you have a lot of fire missions in Geilenkirchen? Were you shooting the 60mm mortar then?
No, we were just carrying the mortar. I don't know that we ever fired the mortar except to exercise it and see if our ammunition was still good.
Okay.
I don't think the mortar section of the 4th platoon really became a rifle platoon.
Okay. Is this where did you fire your rifle for the first time in Geilenkirchen?
Just outside of Geilenkirchen. We went through Geilenkirchen, and we did all the right things about walking down the sidewalk, covering the second story of the houses across the street so the snipers and rear guard couldn't shoot anybody. In Geilenkirchen, the 3rd Battalion of the 333rd Regiment went into Geilenkirchen. There was one casualty. That was the Catholic chaplain.
Okay.
And nobody knows to this day how the Catholic chaplain got wounded, but he did.
What was that? So the Germans pulled back from Geilenkirchen, and then what's your next mission? Where did you guys go from there?
We went through Geilenkirchen, and a couple of miles west of Geilenkirchen, we came upon a chateau, beautiful German building with a courtyard in the center, nice living quarters, plus the barn, all in the same 4 sides of a building with a courtyard in the center. And that became our company headquarters. And from there, we attacked a pillbox in the Siegfried Line. And that's where we had our heaviest fighting that I think that K Company saw in the whole war. We attacked the pillbox for 5 days and 5 nights, and had many once-in-a-lifetime experiences during those 5 days. But the big picture was that after 5 days, we were pulled back in reserve and went back to the city of Geilenkirchen and slept in the basement of a church and got new replacements. But when we started the attack on the pillbox, there were, I think the actual number was 198 men in an infantry company. When we got back to Geilenkirchen in reserve, we had mail call, and at that time there were 44 of us on our feet to get the mail.
What was so hard about that pillbox? Was it a series of pillboxes, or was it one big one?
Well, the way the Germans built the Siegfried Line is every pillbox could cover the one on their left and the one on their right. So that when we got up near the pillbox, I'm talking about maybe 20 yards, we were receiving fire from a couple of pillboxes that were covering each other. They had trenches dug outside the pillbox. They stayed in the trenches with their rifles and machine guns until we got close, and then they could go back into the pillbox and had openings and they could fire on us. And
was this the first time you saw American casualties?
the first American casualty I saw, we were attacking outside of Geilenkirchen toward the chateau.
Right.
And we were in open order drill, if you will, at port arms and the whole thing, very militaristic. And artillery started coming in. And all of a sudden, guys, we were in an open field, and guys started dropping from wounded or killed, I don't know which. And we had one tank as support. It was a Sherman tank manned by the British personnel, and it was on a road on our left flank. And I was in the field, and I saw these guys starting to drop, and I thought, ooh, I think it might be safer if I went over near the tank. So I went over to the road and followed the tank, and then I got thinking, you know what? The Germans are going to concentrate the artillery on this tank. I better get away from here. So I went back, and I think I went through that drill maybe twice.
The casualties assaulting the pillbox, though, it's funny because, as a veteran myself, you think you're invincible until you see someone who's hurt or dead, I feel like that pillbox for you was probably a game changer in the war. Like, well, this is getting serious, especially if you lost almost half the company from attacking that pillbox.
Well, most of the casualties, I think, were wounded. I don't know the actual numbers, but a lot of the casualties were trench foot.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of self-inflicted wounds. There were several mental breakdowns, but the mass of it, I think, was wounded. Number 2, trench foot.
Okay.
And
could you see the Germans running in from the trenches back into the pillbox?
No. The only Germans we saw was 6 of us from the mortar section. Mm-hmm. Really, it amounted to the fact that we got lost. We lost contact with our right, and the British were on our left flank, but we lost contact with the Americans on our right. And we got about 300 yards behind German lines. And we came upon a farmhouse in the middle of a field, and we started receiving heavy small arms fire from the farmhouse. So the British in the tank came up the road, and that tank had a 37 millimeter gun on it, rapid fire gun, and he saw what was happening, and so he fired into the house, and after about 2 minutes, a white flag came out of the house, and 36 Germans surrendered to the 6 of us. So they were the first Germans that we saw, really, other than the prisoners that had been marching back.
Sure.
But they were the first ones in the battlefield.
Did you guys ultimately take that pillbox after the 5
No,
days?
we never took the pillbox. I don't know when that pillbox was ever taken. But it was after the Battle of the Bulge, I can tell you that.
So this is, I would imagine this is the time frame that you guys pulled out of this area and had to engage in the Battle of the Bulge, right?
Well, we pulled out of the no man's land, so to speak, if you want to get dramatic about it, to Geilenkirchen, and we got replacements in Geilenkirchen, and we had to train them because they were coming from Air Corps, Field Artillery, I don't know where all, but they were all very unhappy to be in the infantry, I can tell you that. And then we made a couple of overnight hikes to little villages where we would spend one night and then move out again. And I don't know what was happening, but we were being maneuvered, and we ended up in a German town of Lindern, Lindern. And in Lindern, we stayed for, I believe it was 8 or 9 days in a holding action. And in Lindern, the 4th platoon became a rifle platoon because what we did in Lindern is we'd have half the company in foxholes and half the company in cellars in the village. And then we'd switch. And we would switch in the dark, before dawn and after dark. And the 4th platoon became half of the rifle company. We were never back up to full strength, I might say. Even with replacements, we never got back up anywhere near to full strength. But an interesting part of Lindern, where a lot of once-in-a-lifetime events happened, was we used some foxholes that the Germans had dug. And these foxholes were obviously dug with more than an entrenchment tool. You know, an entrenching tool was a little shovel about 2 feet long that you carried in your pack. And the Germans obviously had big shovels and picks, and they dug L-shaped holes, and then they covered one wing of the L with branches and tree trunks and what have you, piled dirt on top of that and put sod on top of that, so that one section of the L of the foxhole was waterproof. So when you were on duty, if you were lucky to pull duty in a German hole, one guy could be on guard duty while the other guy could take a nap in the dry wing of the foxhole. We nicknamed these foxholes. One of them was the Waldorf Astoria, one of them was the Ritz, and one of them was the Hotel Pennsylvania. I remember those. And we all wanted to do our duty in the German holes, because the holes that we dug, or some of the others which I think the Germans might have dug, were not nearly as luxurious as those 3 holes. One of the interesting experiences which we tell a story about at Lindern was I was in a very crude foxhole one time that looked like a bathtub. It was oval at the top and came down to a very small bottom. And at that time, I might say that it drizzled for days at a time. So most everything was mud. It was cold, but not freezing. And I was in a foxhole with a buddy from Texas, and he was having trouble mentally. In those days, we would say that he was shell-shocked. Today, we'd say he had post-traumatic stress, or at least traumatic stress. And he couldn't stand guard duty, And for some reason, we didn't get relieved after our 12-hour stretch. So I was on my feet for 24 hours straight with a guy who couldn't take turns standing guard duty. And besides being homesick for my wife, I was miserable because of the weather. I was tired, and to make things even worse, I was manning a BAR, Browning automatic weapon. Did they still have those with you?
It's a squad automatic weapon, but it's...
Okay. Well, in those days, there was a Browning automatic weapon, and I never wanted to be on an automatic weapon on the front line because I had the idea that if the Germans counterattacked, they'd go for the automatic weapons first. And I didn't want to be the first one to be in because I was no hero. So I was all around miserable. And during the night, I heard a noise on my left. So I grabbed the BAR and spun around to my left to defend myself. And I looked up out of the foxhole, and there looking me about 4 feet from my face was a cow. Big eyes looking me right in the eye. And so I tried to shoo the cow away because I didn't want the Germans to know that the cow was looking down at my foxhole. And I had never seen her before. I never saw her again, but I always have the memory of her eyes looking at me. But after that, after I was relieved from that foxhole, I went back into the village of Lindern into a cellar, and I happened to pick a cellar that was built like an American cellar rather than the German cellars were built with big heavy stones with arches across, and the house built on the support of the arch, cross arches like a fort. The cellar I went into happened to be built with concrete blocks that the owner had put plaster over the concrete blocks. And every time an artillery shell hit anywhere in Lindern, the concrete blocks would shake a little bit so that there was a mist of dust from the plaster through the whole cellar. And a buddy of mine who had been best man in my wedding, this guy named Don Stauffer, came into the cellar and looked around, and he said, "I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to look for a better cellar. This is a death trap that you're in." Well, I had had that 24-hour duty, so I was exhausted. So I wasn't about to go out, but Stauffer went out, and 5-10 minutes later he came back and said, "Hey, I found a beautiful cellar right across the street. Let's get out of here and go over there where it's much safer." Well, by that time I was lying on the floor, relaxed, and I said to him, "Don, I am so tired. I can't walk up those cellar steps and across the street. I don't care if I get killed. I'm staying where I am. I cannot move out of this cellar." Well, Stauffer, having been my best man, we had been roommates at Drexel in ASTP. We were both mortarmen in K Company, so we were buddies. He had this decision to make. Do I stay with my friend or do I go where it's safe? And after considering it, he decided to stay with me, which I was glad because Stauffer was probably the only guy in our company, maybe in the whole Army, who carried a blanket in his combat pack. And I know that Stauffer would share the blanket. So I was greatly relieved that he decided to stay. And while this was going on, there was a third guy from our platoon, a guy named Faustino Guerra from San Antonio, good buddy of ours. Faustino came in the cellar. So the three of us slept under Don's blanket. And I always say that Faustino and I insisted that Don sleep in the middle where it was less cold than on the outside of the blanket. Well, during the buddy that I had been in the foxhole with from Texas went in the cellar across the street. During the night, a large artillery shell came in and hit in the outside stairway the door of that cellar across the street. And there were 8 men killed and many wounded who were in that cellar. And our death trap, our rickety cellar came through with flying colors, so the three of us were safe.
Unbelievable.
So that's one of those things that just didn't have our name on it at that time.
And how many times do you think in the last 76 years have you thought about that?
Hundreds.
I think about all the time myself with some close calls I've had. Like, I drove past a huge IED once, and the IEDs are the #1 killers of troops overseas.
Yeah, that's right.
I drove by, I saw it in the corner of my eye, I said, that looks suspicious. It was a propane tank, kind of like disguised as a bush, but I was so tired. I drove by it, looked at it, and said maybe it's just a piece of garbage, and then the vehicle behind me spotted it.
Ooh.
And luckily they were able to detonate it, you know.
Yeah.
But I think about it.
Of course you do. I mean, that's a brush with death.
What, you guys were in the Battle of the Bulge, right?
Well, we went from Lindern, and again, I can't explain why, but we made overnight marches. We mostly slept in barns in haylofts in the daytime and marched at night. And we ended up in Belgium when it was sleeting where we were. And we had tremendous artillery fire and machine gun fire all around us. Our left flank, our right flank, we saw flashes of flame from artillery bursts, but we weren't getting shot at. I don't know how to explain that, but we were safe. And this went on, well, for 2 nights. And
Now, was this December or January?
this would have been December. The Battle of the Bulge started December 16. We were in a German city, I believe the name of the city was Palenberg, Germany. And we were pulling guard duty at that time, and that's when the Germans had landed paratroopers behind our lines with American uniforms, and they were misdirecting American convoys and into traps. And so that's when one of the famous things of World War II, when you were on guard duty on a road, you would ask people questions like, what was Joe DiMaggio's number? To see if they were Americans. Yeah. Well, half the boys didn't know Joe DiMaggio. No, I don't know how many Americans shot American soldiers because they didn't know the answers to some stupid questions, but it went on. So I think it was probably December 20 or 21 by the time we got to Belgium. And then we had the nights, and we actually went online Christmas Eve, either the 23rd or the 24th. We were put on the front line. And where we were was on the side of a hill, and the Germans were on top of the hill. And there was a road that went, and this was in the village of Bourdon, Bourdon, Belgium. There was a road the best I can describe it is from the bottom right of the hill up the side of the hill. It had been dug in the side of the hill, so there was a wall there, and it went up to the top of the hill where it made a right angle turn across the top of the hill and into a wooded area. Well, right on the edge of that wooded area, 50 to 100 yards from the right angle turn, was a German tank with an 88 millimeter gun on it. And that gun was pointed right at the right angle turn of the road. In case we tried to go up the road, the gun was there to defend themselves. But they couldn't hit us. We could walk up and down that road freely. And it was like a big extended fire. It was like a trench, I guess is what you call it. And we did walk up and down that road freely. We had a bazooka stationed at the top of the road at the bend in case the tank started to move. The bazooka would be there to knock it out. And a little side issue on this, on Christmas Day, Don Stauffer, the guy I'm talking about, and I were manning the bazooka. And we couldn't dig a foxhole because at that point everything was solid ice. And so we were lying on top of the ice and had the bazooka and had a canvas bag with bazooka rockets in it. And I, after a little while, said to Don, I hope you know how to fire this damn thing because I've never even seen a bazooka before. And Don said he didn't have any idea either. So here's two guys supposed to knock out a German tank that neither one of us knew how to fire the bazooka. But we got out the rocket, we looked at it, and we figured out what we would do if the crisis came, if anything really happened. And it turned out that we were correct in what we would have done. But we decided it would be a good idea if one of us would go back down the road and find out somebody who knew about a bazooka if what we were saying was right. So Don went down the road, and I was on the bazooka by myself. And he was gone for half an hour, and I couldn't figure out what the world happened. Well, what had happened is the cooks had brought Christmas dinner up. You may remember the story that Eisenhower demanded that every American soldier have turkey for Christmas. Well, they brought, and everybody deserted the front line and went back into the village. Bourdon was maybe 15, 20 houses or something like that. Well, they were serving turkey dinner in one of those houses. The whole company was down there, and Don and I were by ourselves and didn't know it. Well, he scared up a couple of people who came up, and then he and I went back down in the village, and we had our turkey. So
your memory's unbelievable.
That was Christmas Day, and then Christmas Day we were lying on the ice, and we saw these thousands of planes coming over. And so Don and I said to each other, go over there and wipe out the whole German country. Mm-hmm. And then we looked at each other and said, and then you sons of bitches, you go back and you get a hot meal and have a ice cream for dessert and a warm bed. But meanwhile, give it to them.
Right.
But while we were on that bazooka, this tank that we were looking directly at the tank, and I can't remember whether it was 50 or 100 yards in front. We could hear the radio in the tank. We could hear the Germans speaking from their radio, so we were pretty close. But behind us was a valley, maybe 2 miles wide, and in the center of that valley was a road. And for some reason, the Americans tried to send a half-track I think probably it was a tank destroyer down that road, and we heard the German tank crank up, and we looked at it, and we could see the 88 tracking that half track, and all of a sudden, phew, we heard a shot, and the projectile went over our heads. Sounded like a freight train, by the way, and in one shot, he demolished that half track. So he obviously had that road zeroed in. So after that, the Americans, for some reason, sent a truck down that road, probably go faster. Same thing, one shot, bang, the truck was gone. After that, a Jeep came down the road going like crazy. It took the gunner 2 shots to hit the Jeep. So they had that road in, but I can tell you this, when the projectile went overhead, it was an ominous sound. And it went right over us. And we never could figure out why they didn't kill us, because they obviously could see us, because we were on top of the ground. Well, we were in a ditch, but we couldn't figure out why didn't the doggone tank crank up and come down and run us over, or at least why didn't the 88 shoot us? And then we figured, well, 2 soldiers probably weren't worth an 88 shell at that point in the war, and we found out many years later when we invited the tank commander over to one of our reunions. The tank commander's name was Gerhard Tebbe, and he came over to a reunion, and he said the reason, number one, there was not one tank there were 12 tanks, but the other 11 were in the woods, so we only saw one, and the reason they didn't run us over was because they were out of gas. And you've heard that story probably about the Battle of the Bulge and the Americans burning our own gas so the Germans couldn't get it. Well, that probably saved my life.
At some point, I believe, the snowdrifts stopped coming in blizzard conditions, right, in January of New Year?
Well, to finish the story, on that road on the 26th of December, day after Christmas, the American artillery decided that they would knock out this tank. So a 4.2-inch mortar, which I think was still active weapon in Iraq, wasn't it?
4.2-inch mortar?
No, you don't know.
Which, American mortar?
Yeah, 4 deuce, they used to call them.
No, we had 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter,
Yeah.
and then the big 120.
Okay, well, in World War II, and for a long time after the war, a very active weapon was a 4.2-inch mortar. And a 4.2-inch mortar could shoot various types of projectiles. Usually it was phosphorus, but this time they were shooting armor-piercing, because they were trying to hit the tank on top of the hill, and a round came in short and hit about 10 yards in front of me, and shrapnel from that round hit me in my right calf just below the knee. So I sat down in the road, and I was pulling the pants leg out of my boot, and my friend Stauffer came over and sat on my right side, and out of the blue came 2 medics, and I have no idea where they came from, what they were doing there. I had never seen them. They had nothing to do with K Company, but these 2 medics came out, and one sat on my left front and the other on my right front. And after they got there, a second round came in exactly where the first round hit, about 10 yards in front of me. And that round, the shrapnel killed both those medics. and they took all the shrapnel, which otherwise would have killed Stauffer and me. That round killed them. They fell over my legs, but that round also tore open my left thigh and butt. So I had the experience of getting hit in the butt while I was sitting down. And so I couldn't stand. I tried to crawl away after lifting the medics off my legs when the forward observer from the field artillery came over and said, "Don't worry, don't worry." He said, "I didn't see the first round, so I had a second round come in at the same spot, and I know what to do now." And, well, unfortunately, the second round killed those two medics. So.
Were you evacuated after this?
A Jeep came right up the road. They put me in a Jeep, took me back to the aid station in the village of Bourdon, gave me a shot of morphine, and I was happy. And an ambulance could come up to Bourdon, and I was taken in an ambulance back to the city of Liège, and I was wounded at just about noon on the 26th. And at midnight, I was taken into an operating room in a hospital which had been set up in a schoolhouse in Liège, Belgium. And I stayed in a tent. I used the schoolhouse for operating rooms, but the recovery rooms were in big tents outside the schoolhouse. I stayed there, I think, for 2 nights, and then I was put on a hospital train and taken to Paris, and I spent New Year's Eve in Paris. Unfortunately, I couldn't roll over in bed even, let alone celebrate. And on New Year's Day, I was flown from Paris to England, and I stayed in England. Well, I was in the hospital 118 days. I was discharged early May, had a week's furlough, and I was on my way back to K Company, and I crossed the channel and I landed in Le Havre on VE Day. And as you can imagine, every whistle was blowing and every horn was blowing, and the French were handing us bottles of wine, and it was a hot day, and we were miserable because we'd been in the hospital out of shape, and we were loaded down already with full field pack, and so, but the war was over.